Hey, welcome everyone. This is really a pilot. I've been wanting to do a series for church leaders, and this is a pilot where I have with me a friend of mine, Pastor Dru Dodson. And Dru Dodson and I I guess we met 7, 8, I don't know if it was that long ago.
Somewhere in 14, around there somewhere, yeah.
And it was really through the work we did together that launched the Exodus Project pre-release program.
Right, kind of by an accidental start.
And then when we started Restore Hope, you were instrumental in getting that up and off the ground.
Yep.
And so I will tell you that, you know, for y'all, why I wanted to do this with Dru is I was working for a church for many years. We were making grants. I was responsible for direct service. And so I had partners, leaders that I supported both local and global. And we were trying to figure out, you know, is there, you know, a way to not only reach outside and do good in the community, but also, you know, have some of those people join the church, be disciple, grow up as leaders, find their place in God's kingdom. And Dru, to me, I had a madman's list of kind of things, and I met Dru. We were at the same event, had lunch with him, and he had thought much more deeply and actually implemented some things that were very interesting to me. And so we became friends and have done some neat stuff since. So
Sure have.
wanted to have this discussion.
Okay.
Hopefully it would be, I know it's going to be beneficial for me.
Okay, we'll see.
Hopefully it can benefit maybe some other church leaders.
Yeah, I hope so. I would hope so.
Specifically, things that we've talked about over the years, Dru, is if you look at kind of church attendance in North America over the past decades, what we have seen specifically over the last 20 years, and even longer than that, but over 20 years, we've got good numbers of the decline in attendance for kind of traditional churches. And then with the pandemic, we're just now coming out of the pandemic in 21.
Man.
It accelerated, of course.
Yes.
So here are my list of questions to you.
Okay.
My mentor.
Oh, yeah, right.
Things Church, right? Is one, what do you think pre-pandemic, what has led to the decline in attendance or the felt need to be a part of a church?
Well, the felt need that's an important question. You know, I think, I don't have like the silver bullet answer, but there are several factors I think have weighed heavily on churches, kind of brick and mortar churches, conventional form churches. Some of it's simply demographics in the generations. You know, the numbers are in. Us baby boomers paid for all these big building churches that we have now. And those folks that are my children's ages and my grandchildren's ages, they're just not interested in that way of doing religion, is how they might put it. What they are interested in is community. They're deeply interested in belonging, and they're deeply interested, and they'll use different phrases for this, you know, making a difference, contributing, poverty, social justice, any number of phrases. So belonging, and what the Bible calls good works, they don't use that term, or what they're hungry for. So we got to ask the question, it seems to me the Bible talks about community like quite a lot. It's one of the main reasons Jesus came, and we're mandated around good works, and yet somehow our forms aren't scratching that itch for a younger and younger demographic.
So you and I've had the benefit of talking with you about this at length and in some structured ways, but can you just shortly talk on forms and functions?
Sure. Well, shortly is a word I don't recognize.
Try hard.
I'll try hard. Yeah, I think that, and this should not be new. A lot of pastors, as well as Christians, regular Christians, are worried and off balance right now because of all these things that you're wanting to talk about. But we've been here before. As the people of Jesus, as the movement that Jesus started, we've been here before. And when we hit these major bumps in the road, major hinges of history, or what Phyllis Tickle calls an every 500-year garage sale that the church has, when we hit these moments, what we do when we're in our right mind is we don't panic, we go back to our sources. We go back to the scriptures. We go back perhaps into history and learn the lessons, both good and bad. And what we're asking is we should quit asking, how do we salvage this form? We need to be asking, what functions are we called to be committed to? What are we, people of Jesus, supposed to be doing? And not even, frankly, so much believing. We've got lots of history on the believing. So when I say function, it's time for some of us, those of us who have leadership and responsibility, whether actual clergy or not, but we have responsibility, we need to be going back and asking, what is it actually that this movement does? What did Jesus have in mind for us to go and do? What does it look like if there's a strong church? What does that strong church engage in? What does it do? So I think function is pretty self-explanatory, but see, what happens is we assume function. We've been doing it this way for a long time. Our denomination does it this way. You guys are fine over there. You Methobapterians are okay. But us guys over here, we do it differently. And we just assume that we're doing the functions, and then we'll want to argue about form. Mega or house church or...
Yeah, for instance, what would be kind of forms, not functions?
Here's the big one. A function is the gathering of the community of the Jesus people in any given neighborhood or city. From the Old Testament, from the time of Abraham on, God's people gather. Mm-hmm. Okay, so gathering is a function. Sunday morning in a building is a form. That's a big one.
Now you're messing.
Now we're messing because we're so deeply committed to that form.
Yeah.
Now we'll add stuff to it, and we'll get real creative on how we're doing that form, right? And we'll hold multiple types of services, but we're still stuck in this form that we got to get into a building somewhere on a Sunday morning slot, or we'll add in a Saturday night and a blah, blah, blah. But that's just an obvious one that we don't think about. We almost never rethink the gathering function. Or we'll see someone go off and do something kind of, Fruit Loopy on the gathering thing. But we need to go back to the sources. This is what the reformers did 500 years ago. They just began to rethink some functions. And then they began to bring that critique to the forms. That's what we need to do. And we may end up improving forms. We may end up jettisoning some forms. But the first step, before we get all reformer-minded and start selling off buildings and shutting stuff down, we just need to go back to the sources and rethink function.
Drew, is when I was performing a missions pastor role, one of the things that, in people that I read, people like you that I interacted with, is if you were going to try to, go and reach people and teach them to obey all that I commanded, right? Then if you were going to make a strategy around that, which is where I see a lot of, one of the things, that's just how I think, but also where I saw a lot of it crumble. Yep. Because you assume some forms.
Yep.
Had to have a children's ministry.
Yep.
And those things aren't bad.
Heck no.
It's just,
right.
If you need a building and you need a parking lot and grass growed and all these things, all of a sudden, the amount of money and effort to be able to get there and keep it there started to impede the ability to multiply.
Very expensive forms, which makes it hard to scale.
Yeah.
That's true in anything, right? That's true in business. If you've got too much overhead, it's hard to scale. And that's true, it turns out, in the Christian movement as well.
And so let's get back to kind of what you think, so declining attendance, declining membership.
Right.
I heard just recently, I don't know if this has been true and haven't vetted this, but I heard on a Christian radio station that 1 in 5 churches thinks that they might have to close their doors this year.
Right.
Now, this is post-pandemic.
Right.
And so it was tough for 19 years.
Anyway,
20th year, 2020 was devastating for many.
Brutal.
So what do you...
There's another factor there, too.
Yeah, what do you think is going to happen to the North American church?
Well, the Church of Jesus Christ will be here. It will endure. And it will not only endure, it will thrive to some degree, and it will fulfill its mission to some degree, as it's done for 20 centuries. Our current forms of come see what we're doing and see if we can talk you into joining us, that's going to slowly die. What's happening right now is not just the pandemic, but also the political polarization has accelerated that trend. I think we just chopped off about 20 years of the deterioration curve.
And in the political polarization, so Trump lost the election at this point where we are.
Yep.
Trump lost,
and even before him, what the demographic thing that's happening is even when we're right about some issue, and some of the issues around Trump and his leadership and the evangelical endorsement, we evangelicals voted at a rate of about 80% plus for him twice, because we believed that he was right about certain things. What we have failed to understand is that we look so ugly to so many people who want spiritual meaning, who want belonging, who want love and purpose in their life. But they're not going to come knocking on our door. We just look too ugly. So I actually do, we'll maybe talk about this in a minute in terms of the positive turn. We're under a mandate to make Jesus and his message beautiful and believable. And we have managed, with good intentions of being right, we have managed to make it look pretty ugly to the outsiders that we are actually called to serve. Now, we look pretty good to the insiders. We're standing for truth. We're saying the right things from the pulpit. Our people who are already convinced are cheering us on. And all those people that Jesus told us to reach in his name, we look pretty ugly.
and so let's assume, right, given that we stood for truth and we did that well and weren't wrong.
Right.
Why is that then important in, the outsiders, as you call them? Why is that important?
I picked up a phrase from Dr. Tim Keller, out of New York. I've been talking about beautiful and believable, but he has a little bit bigger platform than I do. and he talks about emotional apologetics. Have you heard this phrase?
No, I have not.
It's a wonderful phrase. And he's got such a brain, and he's so clear on what he believes, and he's such a good communicator of it. But he says, actually, that's not what will win the day in this new setting, in this new time, in this hinge of history, in this garage sale. He said, we got to do emotional apologetics. Well, what's that, Dr. Keller? That's that we conduct ourselves and live in such a way and love on people in such a way that they wish all of our superstitious beliefs were true.
Yeah.
That I can't buy all that Jesus stuff and that resurrection bit and all that walking on the water stuff, and I'm not sure about that sexuality, that ethic, but I got to tell you one thing. I wish it was true because I love how those Christians live. Well, you know what? It turns out that's how the early Christians won the Roman Empire. They didn't talk anybody into it. They just outlived them. They lived in such a way that pagan Romans said, I kind of like all the gods. They say there's just one God. I'm not sure about that. But I got to tell you, they saved my daughter from the last plague. They fed my family when we were starving to death.
Drew, the thing that has hopefully centered me, if I've been centered at all, or corrected a wrong course that I've taken, is, Jesus said they'll know you by your love, so your love for one another. But I think also for your love, clearly there were people that were hanging around Jesus that were not welcome in religious institutions.
Yes.
And there were religious people that hung around Jesus
Yes.
and liked it. But the people that really seemed to have a real problem with him seemed to be all within the religious institutions. He didn't seem to be doing it in a way that they appreciated, to the point that they killed him for blasphemy.
It threatened the forms. This is one thing we just have to understand. It's not just Christianity, but we're talking here as Christians. We get deeply invested in the forms, and the Jewish leaders of his day were deeply invested in the forms. The Sanhedrin, the Pharisees, the Sadducees. There was lots of money flowing through the temple and to the priesthood. Plus, they had the Romans on their back, and they had. We get deeply invested in the forms, and along comes a traveling rabbi like Jesus, and he's talking about new wineskins. That's new forms. That's what that language means, new forms. And the people who are running the current forms aren't having it. It's that old trite saying, it's really hard to change a man's mind if his job depends on him not changing it.
Yeah.
And that's true in the church world too.
Yeah. The thing that I have seen is that folks in the church, I think, to your point, can seem like they're angry and hateful. And it's one thing to be right and to tell someone else you're wrong, but if you're screaming at them and making sure that they understand that they are
how right you are and how wrong they are,
then I just don't. I only saw Jesus do that to one group of people, and they tend to be the religious folks in the church.
People.
Everyone else, he would tell them, "Don't sin anymore.
Right?
You've you've not done this right," and so he didn't.
Yep. He almost looked soft on sin when the person in front of him is a prostitute or a Roman occupying soldier, and he's really, really, really hard on religious arrogance, like really hard. And here's an internal problem that it's hard for me to go shortly on this one, but I will. I'll try to go shortly on this one too. It's not just how we present ourselves, it's actually our internal discipleship or training. We train people to think right about the gospel, and that is important, okay. But actually what's more important, see, the gospel, we both know the gospel means good news, right? It doesn't mean correct news. It means good news. And the problem with so many of us church folk, I've been church folk since I was born, all right? The problem is it's correct news, and we'll go to the mat, and we'll defend it, and we'll write stuff to the editor, and we will defend it because it's correct. But the problem is the gospel is not emotionally good news to us believers. We're still jumping through hoops trying to get God off our back. We're still trying to do it just right, do it correctly, believe correctly, live correctly, so that he won't zap us or punish us through our children or make us lose that job or help us get that job as long as we do it just right. We actually haven't believed our own message that this is good news, not correct news, good news.
You know, Romans 4:8 is one of those verses that mean, because I thought how short it encapsulates everything that I'm happy about, because I wasn't a Christian until my mid-30s.
Oh, right? Yeah, right. I remember that.
And so that Romans 4:8 says, blessed is the man whose sin God will not hold against him. I mean, I don't know how to get the gospel any shorter.
It's like the understatement of the millennium.
Yeah.
See, I'm glad you quoted it because I don't yet have the whole Bible memorized, so I wasn't sure what verse you were talking about. That's great.
Isn't that great?
It's great. Okay, I got one.
That's good news.
I got another one for you. This is from Peter, in 1 Peter somewhere. Love covers a multitude of sins. Yeah. I'm telling you, I've been hanging on to that one the last few years. See, that's good news, right? It actually stirs your heart. You get a little goosebumps thinking about, I can breathe. Well, see, here's what will happen. As soon as we Christians appropriate the gospel as emotionally good news, then our whole demeanor changes to that jerk at work or to that person that we're trying to evangelize. We are suddenly coming from a place of settledness and peace ourselves, not so strident, not so antagonistic. We can still talk about the truth, but now we're coming from a place where our heart and emotions are settled. We've been healed, at least to some degree, by the love of Christ. It's a whole different presentation now to the world.
So let's shift a little then, Drew, and talk about, so we've done work, kind of outreach or to others. We've done this in prison. We've done it now in the communities to families that are in crisis.
Right.
And, I told everyone that this was kind of a pilot. It's something that we've been talking about. It's something I've been dreaming about as we've gotten Restore Hope to, it was a model that we built.
Right.
Now it turns out it's scalable.
Turns out.
And one of the outcomes that stunned me, frankly, was that parents who had their kids in foster care in Arkansas at this time, they only get their kids reunified, is what we call it.
Yeah.
They get their kids back 42% of the time. But with the model that we've created, it's 85% of the time.
That's remarkable. That is remarkable.
And so now what we're starting to talk about now is how does a church that wants to serve its community, especially those that are in crisis, the poor, the least of thee, whatever word you want to throw on it, but it's folks in need in their community. There's should you, and then inspiring stories about it, but there's this layer of, then how do you do it?
How do you do it?
What's the 20 steps to install the model and those things? And so ultimately I desire to be able to communicate how to do that.
Yes. Yes.
But anyway, you've written, one of the things that drew me to you was you had written a book. Your doctoral thesis was called Outposts.
Yep.
And so could you shortly?
Yeah. Doctoral thesis in a few minutes.
Book,
Sure.
right. And so, what was kind of the main themes behind that?
Yeah, the big idea there was that the church has abdicated many of our assignments from our master, and we farmed it out to other people, whether that be government or other agencies and organizations. And that particular thesis was about the fact that economic and financial relief and development, whether around the world or here at home, which we had tended in the past to call like welfare, but economic development actually should be one of the best pitches that the church has. We should be deeply engaged in blessing the poor, not just by handing out money, that's required occasionally, but mostly by getting involved in our communities and plotting and planning to meet urgent needs through sustainable long-term solutions that can only be done if you've got a relationship. See, a lot of people can give away money and should. The church ought to be uniquely qualified to form community and establish relationships. And as you know in your work, it turns out that the right relationships in the right community actually is a secret sauce to reducing recidivism. Yeah.
In the social science, one of the things that they'll point to as kind of causal to poverty or a barrier to overcoming poverty is something that they call social capital.
Yeah.
It's just opportunity. Yeah. Right. I know
I know somebody that knows somebody.
You can give me a job or help me buy the car.
Guys like me and you that's part of what some people would call privilege. We just have that. If I needed something today, I can call you, who can call someone, and pretty soon I'm talking to someone who can fix it or help me. And so many people can't even make that first call.
No, they can't.
That's right.
They don't have anyone that has any power or influence.
Well, so the church is this unbelievable grassroots network. Crosses neighborhood lines, crosses racial lines, crosses economic lines. It's this big, throbbing network that we never use. And that was kind of the burden of that thesis was we don't have to invent this. God invented it when he put the church together. We just have not understood who we are and what we have available to us. That was kind of the thrust of it.
One of the observations that occurred to me a number of years ago, and I can't remember when it did. It might have been about the time that we were having these deep talks, even traveling to Guatemala, so I could trap you on a plane and quiz you for hours on end. But that, in the form of church, of Sunday church,
right.
there's nothing wrong. There's nothing blasphemous or anything about it. But where is it that the gathered family of God can actually do the one another's? And so, you obviously have the gift of teaching and have done that for 28 years in the pulpit.
Yep.
And you've married and buried, and so there are these functions that need to happen. But the way that I understand it is, I don't need to be in the pulpit.
Right.
It's not my gifting.
Right.
But I have some gifts.
You might be fun up there for a little bit.
And right. You bet. Like the youth pastor, you put me up once per year and let me get all my stuff out. But I have gifts. How do I exercise those gifts for the good of the body and for the good of the community?
Yep. Okay, so you ask good questions, but these are big topics. But here's maybe a basic conviction I have. Our forms are pretty top-heavy. We're both sitting here speaking into microphones, and of course that's necessary. It turns out in church, we guard access to the microphone more than we guard the virgin birth of Christ, okay? Because microphone is power, microphone is influence. We've got to find the right ways now to flatten that. Here, let me say a little bit more about that. My experience has been, if we teachers, preachers, leaders can give people better Bible-based frameworks and convictions and understandings and flatten the hierarchy, it turns out that regular Christians filled with the Spirit of Christ who are developing the mind of Christ, they can solve problems. It's not so much that every pastor has to figure out his city. In fact, the pastors are sometimes uniquely not qualified because of their position as clergy to know who the power brokers are, what's really going on in that hood, what's really going on at city council. It turns out that the people in our pews, so to speak, even though they're all chairs now, but the people in our pews, they're uniquely positioned to know where the leverage points are. What we've got to do is empower guys like you, and that's part of why we're sitting here at Restore Hope. Somewhere, somehow, you got empowered, and you began to believe that your voice and that your vision was of Christ, and you went for it. Well, instead of that being like an exceptional story, we need to be thinking and praying and working towards that being a more common story. We don't need to empower the pulpit, we need to empower the pew. And that's going to take a flatter form, and that's going to take some deeper thought for us leaders on exactly what is the gospel. How can it become emotionally good news?
You know, one of the problems, the barriers I see to any of that change is, even though many churches are in decline financially, the economic engine truly is tied to the form.
Yes, it is. And it's, Jesus ran straight into this. That's why he was issuing warnings about wineskins and that sort of thing. And so I don't know. Someone has said, look, the best way to critique or institute long-term change is not to go around whining or pontificating about the current form, but rather start something new.
Yeah.
And if it fails, because a lot of the new stuff will fail.
Absolutely.
But you know about that. But when it works, it's an implied friendly critique of the last form. This is normal and natural. This is how the world works. It's how animal kingdom, the plant kingdom, and the Christian kingdom works. Is we're always having to go back to the sources and get new wineskins. So yes, I think 50 years from now there'll be brick and mortar churches down at 4th and Main with choirs wearing robes and a guy in a pulpit and everybody sitting in straight rows listening to them. And that is exactly what God will have for some people. Mm-hmm. I'm not in any business of bashing that. Some of us are restless. I know you. That's why we hit it off. We both were just we couldn't sit still.
I could see the trend coming, and I know you did too. So
something's happening, and so I do think God calls the restless ones to start to pioneer the next forms with a plural S. There's not one answer. Many of them will fail, but some of us are called to do the new wineskins and see what hangs together. And let the guys who are called to shepherd the existing forms, we should support them, pray for them, encourage them, be available to them, because maybe we'll figure out something that actually does help an existing form. But some of us need to get out there and pioneer. And here's where the existing churches could help us. They could cheer us on. They could send some money. They could take some of the restless people, those guys in their congregation who aren't happy running a small group or handing out bulletins on Sunday morning, those guys that keep asking those irritating questions about the poor, send them to some of us who are pioneering, and let us partner up and figure out what's next.
And so just to kind of start turning us to the model or maybe a form that could exist.
A form.
And I'm thinking specifically around what Restore Hope does and has kind of figured out is it's not a church, it's not a church plant, but it is a way to serve, and it is a way for a church to become very, very relevant in their community and solving some of the hardest, most complex problems that are persistent in communities that governments in all 50 states are throwing gobs and gobs of money at
without making a dent.
Do not seem to reduce recidivism, to increase reunification rates, to move folks from crisis to career. And so that I think that's what uniquely we have to offer right now to those that are interested. Is there's a model here that works. It has outcomes. It has a way that a church could participate. It doesn't have to do it all. It's just connecting people to resource. You can track effectiveness, and then ultimately you can measure outcome. And through it, parts of the churches and communities find themselves in positions of influence in their community because of what they do. Because they become trusted, respected members of the community that are actually producing outcomes that are extraordinary And therefore, I think it goes back to what your vision is, you know, Dru believes some really odd things that I don't agree with, but I'm so glad that he's here.
Yes. Yes. It turns out that's really biblical, everything you just said. Now, we were starting Lake Valley and Hot Springs all those years ago, 1993. One of our founding guys, they just kind of quipped what we're going to do, talking about Hot Springs in general. We're just going to love them to the point of confusion. And I thought that was pretty good. So it turns out that's actually the message of big chunks of the New Testament. We talked about Titus a little bit. At the very end of Titus, Paul tells Titus, I want you to train these new churches to do this. I want them to begin to prepare resources. I want them to plot and plan to meet the urgent needs of their community. This is the last marching orders. He didn't talk about a worship program. He didn't talk about an evangelism program. Now, Paul is all for worship and evangelism,
Sure.
okay? But he's got this little short amount of space, shortly. He had to talk shortly to Titus. And here's what I want you to leave with these churches. When they gather, be preparing money, resources, plot, plan. Don't just kind of wing it, plan to meet the urgent needs of the community, not just of the Christians. If we could adopt that sort of outward eyes, outward looking, if we would let other community members be in the driver's seat. See, one problem with churches and preachers is we've got to be in charge. If we can just be a fellow traveler, if we could if they could invite us in, if here's a novel idea for us preachers, what if we would just listen for 2 or 3 years and kind of understand what's really going on? And then what if we had human conversations? And I won't go on about this, I could, but what I mean by that is every human being, suffering or wealthy, doing great or not, they're interested in meaning, purpose. What do I do in the midst of suffering? Is there meaning and purpose in the face of suffering? Just have human conversations. Every human being will talk about that. Out of that, I guarantee will come gospel conversations. I absolutely guarantee it. Put my hand on the Bible because that's what the Holy Spirit does. But if we could start with invitation, listening, serving, taking the unbelievable resources of the church, both in people and money, and begin to plot and plan as part of our mandate from Jesus, from the Apostle Paul. This is not some kind of weirdo social liberal agenda. This is what Paul said to do. If we could get super intentional and have the human conversations as we go, I think we would be stunned at how we could become resources for people. They would begin to look to Jesus people once again. Because again, like I said earlier, I'm not sure about all that stuff they believe, but I got to tell you what, it was beautiful what they did for my family or my neighborhood.
You know, to illustrate some of that, Dru, and we've been working longest in Fort Smith, and there are several churches that are a part. We put a coalition together. It's called an alliance, and that alliance signs up to help 100 families at a time move from crisis to career.
Remarkable.
And there are assessment tools so you can find out exactly where someone is, and someone may need 4 months, and someone over 2 years. You know, and so you're meeting people where they are. But what I have seen for several of the churches, and these are all different denominations, and that many of the pastors and the leaders and the lay leaders that are coming, and they'll just tell me a story of someone who they had a suspended driver's license in district court, and then they had a child welfare case. And because of all the stress, they were abusing substances, which was getting them in more trouble. And they were just at the end of the rope. And then they were met by the community, including faith community, being a good member there. And they were going to church, and they're getting baptized, and their kids, the person who was fostering their children happened to be, close and recommended they go to the church. And they were welcomed in and loved where they were. And many of the individuals actually now, not all, we serve thousands.
Right.
But many people
it will happen.
Have come into contact, and what they will say is what you're saying is they helped me get a job.
Sure.
They helped me get a house. I was not in a safe place, but me and my children are in a safe place. I'm now stable, and you know what we can do? Now with the software and the model, I can tell you exactly where stability is, and it's defined. And you can show the plot over time. And now we're working on career paths. There's all this help in every one of our communities to get people into trucking school or welding school or CNA.
See?
And
See, this is your fastball. See, if you ask a church staff to figure all that stuff out, it's a non-starter, right? We've talked about this, and we may as well talk about it on air, so to speak. We need to find ways to partner churches with Restore Hope with 100 Families, because I'll talk about as I put my pastor hat on. Our fastball is community and sacrificial love. If you're anywhere close to doing what Jesus wants you to do, then we should be really, really good at accepting one another as Jesus accepted you. Romans 15. If we can stay in our lane and do community and sacrificial love, plot and plan to help, and then hook up with someone like you that actually knows the ropes and who the partners are. See, I think a lot of pastors and church staff guys get really intimidated because I know that my experience with you was I thought I knew something about how the government worked. I had no idea. You've learned it. So I guess that's what I'm just responding to you there is, if you ask a church to relearn all that, non-starter. But what if we could partner?
That's Drew. That's what I hope that we can get a couple of other folks, and maybe we could kind of take a journey together. But I will say, going back to forms and functions, I think the forms of outreach or serving the community, or because I participated in and made grants on behalf of the church and served on boards, and
Sure.
and there's a lot of good that was done, but much of what is done is transactional.
Oh, that's good. That's a good word.
Okay, so a new
It's a good bad word.
I'm hoping that we can, if many forms need to constantly exist, what I'm hoping is that through what we figured out with 100 Families, we could offer to some churches as a new form that hits marks that no church that I had ever partnered with hits. You've got a plan.
Yep.
You can track inputs. You can track outcomes.
Yep.
You don't have to do it all.
Yep.
You're connected. There are all these resources out there, so that we're training. We're training you in the effective way to engage.
Yep.
Someone that's in crisis.
Yep. See, that's a conversation for another day, probably. But that's what happens when a network gets focused on the mission, and the big dog organization doesn't put itself at the middle and say, "Everybody come play in our sandbox," which is too often what churches in the past have done, and nonprofits do it too as well. But if we could actually be like Jesus and seek to serve and put the mission to bless the poor at the center and partner up with whoever is focused on that mission. And, this might get me in trouble on your show, I'm sorry, but I don't care if they worship purple cows. If they're focused on that mission, I'll find some way to partner with them to get that thing done.
I couldn't agree with you more.
Yeah.
It is. And so when you're talking about the community, you're talking about the people in the community.
Indeed.
And some people may worship purple cows. So, and if you can define what it is, we're going to help 100 families in crisis move from crisis to career.
It was so genius to reduce that to something you could get your hands on. Yep.
And we've defined crisis and we've defined career.
Yep.
And if you want to take a part in that, it's your community too. Come on, let's go.
So now how many thousands of churches are scattered around this little old backwater state? Thousands and thousands. Full of good-hearted people who want to help. And we'll help if they have rails to run on. So maybe that's something we can figure out, is some rails to run on.
Well, I hope we do. And so this was a pilot. Thanks for joining us for a conversation. Thanks, Drew, for coming. I have really benefited over the years from your wisdom.
It's just been fun.
And
we got some stuff. We made a few dents along the way.
Yes, we did. Yes, we did. We'll see if we can't make some more.
Yeah, I like it.